It was the summer of 1950, and the air in Los Alamos, New Mexico, tasted of dust and the metallic tang of newly forged history. The site was synonymous with the atom bomb, a place where humanity had recently learned to shatter the fundamental building blocks of reality. But on this particular afternoon, the conversation had shifted from the mechanics of destruction to the mechanics of the cosmos. Enrico Fermi, a man whose mind moved with the precise, unstoppable momentum of a theoretical steam engine, was walking to lunch with three colleagues, Edward Teller, Emil Konopinski, and Herbert York. The New Mexico sun was brutal, bleaching the desert landscape into a blinding expanse of white and tan. The men were discussing a recent cartoon in the New Yorker, blaming a spate of missing municipal trash cans on a crew of industrious, saucer-flying aliens. It was a light-hearted conversation, the kind of intellectual banter that brilliant men indulge in when they momentarily step away from the grueling equations of nuclear physics. They sat down to eat. The conversation drifted to other topics, wandering through the labyrinth of mid-century science and politics. But Fermi's mind was still chewing on the saucer cartoon. He possessed an uncanny ability to reduce incomprehensibly complex problems to stark, inescapable arithmetic. Suddenly, in the middle of the meal, out of nowhere, Fermi looked up from his plate. His eyes, usually sharp and analytic, held a strange, sudden realization. The table went quiet. He looked at his colleagues, men who had helped build the weapon that could unmake the world, and asked a question that would haunt astrophysics for the next century. "Where is everybody?" he asked. It was a simple question, 3 words, but it was a question that broke the back of human intuition. Fermi had roughly calculated the probability of Earth-like planets, the likelihood of life, the inevitable march of technological progress, and the colossal age of the Milky Way. His mental arithmetic pointed to a glaring, horrifying conclusion. The universe should be absolutely teeming with intelligent civilizations. The galaxy should look like a crowded Manhattan street, filled with the noise and light of countless empires expanding across the stars. Instead, as Fermi pointed out, there was nothing. No radio signals, no massive engineering projects blotting out distant stars, no probes arriving in our solar system. The sky wasn't just quiet, it was aggressively, unnervingly silent. This is the great paradox, the intellectual open wound of modern cosmology. We are stranded at the bottom of a gravity well, staring up at a sky that should be packed with neighbors, screaming into a void that simply refuses to scream back. A decade later, in 1961, at the Green Bank Observatory nestled in the quiet mountains of West Virginia, astrophysicist Frank Drake attempted to formalize Fermi's lunchtime question. Drake gathered a small, elite group of scientists to discuss the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Among them was an energetic, fiercely intelligent young astronomer named Carl Sagan. Together, they stared at the massive radio dish outside the facility, a colossal ear cupped toward the heavens, waiting for a whisper in the cosmic static. Drake stepped to a blackboard and began to write. He constructed an equation, a string of variables that would define the probability of finding a communicable civilization in our galaxy. He factored in the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the number of planets capable of supporting life, the fraction of those where life actually emerges, the fraction where intelligence develops, the fraction that developed the technology to broadcast signals into space, and finally, the length of time such civilizations release detectable signals before they, inevitably or accidentally, go quiet. "Look at the numbers, Carl," Drake might have said, wiping chalk dust from his hands and staring at the sprawling equation. The room was heavy with the weight of the variables. Even if we are incredibly conservative with these fractions, even if we assume that life is a rare fluke and intelligence is an even rarer anomaly, the scale of the galaxy is just too massive. Sagan, leaning against a desk, watching the massive dish slowly rotate outside the window, understood the implications instantly. If we are alone, Frank, Sagan noted, his voice carrying that characteristic cadence of awe and scientific precision, it is a terrible waste of space. But the reality of the numbers was far more disturbing than a mere waste of space. To understand the depth of the Fermi Paradox, you must forcefully peel away human bias and confront the raw, unfeeling scale of the universe. The observable universe contains approximately 2 trillion galaxies. Each of those galaxies holds hundreds of billions of stars. Our own Milky Way is a swirling whirlpool of roughly 400 billion suns. The sheer statistical probability that this single, unremarkable rock orbiting a tedious yellow dwarf star in the galactic suburbs is the only place where chemistry woke up and started asking questions is statistically absurd. It is a mathematical impossibility. Furthermore, you must consider the timeline. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. Our solar system only formed 4.5 billion years ago. That means the universe had a 9 billion year head start before Earth even coalesced from a cloud of cosmic dust. There are stars out there that are billions of years older than our sun. If even a tiny fraction of those ancient stars produced habitable planets, and if even a fractional percentage of those planets developed intelligent life, then there should be civilizations out there that are millions, if not billions, of years older than humanity. Think about what humanity has achieved in just the last 300 years. We went from burning coal and crude steam engines to splitting the atom, mapping the human genome, and landing robots on the surface of Mars. Now, take that exponential rate of technological explosion and project it forward not by 300 years, but by 3 million years. A civilization that old wouldn't just be sending radio waves. They would be restructuring their entire solar systems. They would be harnessing the total energy output of their stars. If an advanced empire decided to colonize the Milky Way, and they sent out self-replicating probes at a mere 1% of the speed of light, a technological feat we can almost theoretically achieve today, those probes would cross the entire galaxy in about 10 million years. 10 million years is a long time for a human, but it is a microscopic blip on the cosmological calendar. The galaxy should have been entirely colonized, mapped, and filled with the infrastructure of a Type 3 civilization long before the first dinosaur laid an egg on Earth. So we return to Fermi's dining table. Where is everybody? Where are the probes? Where are the galactic superhighways? Where is the noise? Step outside tonight and look up at the night sky. The stars burn with a cold, indifferent beauty, but look closer. That beauty is a facade masking an incomprehensible emptiness. Not a single beacon flashes a prime number. Not a single engine flare burns across the Orion arm. Not a single artificial structure eclipses the steady light of a distant quasar. The heavens are completely, aggressively quiet. Are we the first? Did the cosmic lottery randomly select humanity to be the vanguard of consciousness in a dead universe? Or did something else happen? Are we the only ones foolish enough to make noise? For decades, scientists leaned on the Copernican principle, the fundamental baseline of modern astronomy, which dictates that the Earth is not in a central, specially favored position. We are mediocre. The Sun is an average star. The galaxy is an average spiral. Therefore, the emergence of life on Earth must also be average. It must be common. But in 1975, astrophysicist Michael Hart published a paper that sent a chilling tremor through the scientific community. He introduced what became known as Fact A, the simple, undeniable fact that there are no intelligent beings from outer space currently present on Earth. Hart tore into the optimistic assumptions of the Drake equation. He argued that if extraterrestrials existed, their colonization efforts would have reached Earth by now. Because they are not here, he concluded, they must not exist. If life is common, Hart asked the astrophysical community, why does the silence deafen us? Why is the sky an empty graveyard? The debate fiercely intensified. The paradox stopped being just an interesting intellectual puzzle and became an existential horror story. If you walk into a massive, supposedly crowded auditorium and find no one there, your first thought is not that you are the only person who received an invitation. Your first thought is that you missed an evacuation order. Your first thought is that something terrible has happened, and you are the only one who doesn't know about it. The silence of the cosmos is not a comforting blanket. It is a terrifying void. It suggests that one of our foundational assumptions about the universe is catastrophically wrong. Either life is incredibly, impossibly rare, making our existence an isolated miracle balancing on a razor's edge, or life is common, intelligence is common, but something prevents them from ever reaching out. Something stops them from colonizing the stars. Perhaps civilizations inevitably destroy themselves. Perhaps the discovery of nuclear fission or the creation of artificial intelligence inherently leads to civilizational suicide before a species can build a generation ship. This is the tragic interpretation of the paradox. A galaxy full of ruins, ashes tumbling through the void, societies popping into existence like sparks from a fire, only to burn out into darkness milliseconds later. But there is a third option, an option far darker than being alone, an option more terrifying than inevitable self-destruction. What if the universe is not empty? What if the universe is full, but everyone is intentionally hiding? What if transmitting a radio signal into the deep black is the equivalent of a toddler crying out in the middle of a jungle filled with predators? When you stare into the screaming silence of the night sky, you are not looking at an empty stage. You are looking at a battleground where the losers are erased and the winners are invisible. You are looking at a dark forest, and the trees are full of hunters. Picture a dark forest at the paralyzing hour of midnight. The air is thick, saturated with the smell of damp earth, rotting pine, and ancient shadows clinging to the skin like a physical shroud. A hunter sneaks through the trees, moving like a ghost. He pushes branches aside with the agonizing, deliberate slowness of a man who knows that a single snapped twig equates to an instantaneous death sentence. His breathing is shallow, synchronized perfectly with the rustle of the wind through the leaves. He clutches a rifle, the cold steel barrel pressing into his sweating palms. He must not make a sound because the forest is full of other hunters doing the exact same thing. In this pitch-black wilderness, every shadow is a potential threat. If he stumbles across someone else, whether it is a beautifully innocent traveler, a lost child crying for help, or a heavily armed murderer aiming at his chest, he cannot risk taking the time to uncover their true nature. He cannot stop to ask for their intentions. He cannot know if they are an angel or a demon. The calculus of survival in the dark forest is brutally, horrifyingly simple. He must shoot first. He must aim, fire, and permanently silence the other shape in the dark before that shape has the opportunity to silence him. This terrifying scenario is not a horror story concerning human depravity. It is a cosmological model. It is the dark forest theory, and it completely redefines the Fermi Paradox by framing existence and survival in the cosmos as a zero-sum game of absolute suspicion, crushing paranoia, and preemptive strikes. The agonizing silence of the universe is not an accident of biology, nor is it a quirk of radio technology. It is a tactical necessity. The concept was most famously articulated by the visionary Chinese science fiction author Liu Cixin in his monumental novel The Dark Forest, the second installment of the critically acclaimed three-body problem trilogy. But while it gained widespread public attention and Netflix adaptations, as a piece of brilliant fiction, astrophysicists, evolutionary biologists, and philosophers have quietly debated very similar evolutionary concepts for decades. The entire theory operates on a cold, unfeeling foundation of cosmic sociology, built upon two universally unyielding axioms. The first axiom is simple, elegant, and almost universally accepted by any student of biology. Survival is the primary need of any civilization. Before a species can create transcendent art, formulate complex philosophy, or engineer technological wonders, it must absolutely guarantee its own continued existence. Survival is the biological programming hardwired into the deepest recesses of every living creature on Earth. From the microscopic, single-celled amoeba instinctively moving away from a lethal toxin, to a sprawling human empire constructing continent-spanning nuclear deterrents, the mandate is identical: stay alive, do not die. The second axiom is the mathematical trap that springs the lock on the universe. Civilizations continuously grow and expand, but the total matter in the universe remains stubbornly constant. A civilization that survives will inevitably multiply. Its energy needs will skyrocket. It will expand to fill its planet, then its entire solar system, and then the neighboring stars. But the galaxy, massive as it is, acts as a finite petri dish. The resources required to fuel a multi-star empire, the raw energy, the heavy metals, the real estate, are limited. Eventually, growing empires must intersect, and when they intersect, they must compete. Imagine a sociologist tasked with explaining this horrifying reality to a high-ranking military general, perhaps standing over a star map holographic display in a subterranean command bunker. The sociologist, his face illuminated by the blue light of 1,000 distant suns, traces the expansion rings of two hypothetical, newly discovered alien empires. General, the sociologist says, his voice devoid of any comforting emotion, the mathematics are a certainty. You cannot guarantee they mean no harm. Even if they broadcast a message claiming benevolence or declaring a peaceful intent, you cannot trust the message. If you wait to verify their intentions, which takes centuries at the speed of light, you hand them the opportunity and the time to destroy you. If you cannot guarantee their peaceful nature with absolute mathematical certainty, you must assume they are hostile. The equations of survival demand it. The military general, staring hard at the overlapping, flashing circles of expansion on the star map, completely understands the brutal tactical reality. If you assume hostility, he replies sharply, there is only one logical action to take. We must strike before they even realize we are tracking them. That action brings us to the core mechanism, the engine of terror driving the theory, the chain of suspicion, and the explosive concept of technological acceleration. On Earth, human societies can communicate relatively easily, even across hostile borders. If two tribes or nations meet, they can talk. They can trade goods. They can establish treaties, hold diplomatic summits, and sign armistices. Even if they deeply mistrust each other, they can observe each other's actions in real time. But in the vast, unimaginable distances of space, communication is hopelessly, agonizingly slow. If a civilization is situated 100 light years away from Earth, a negligible distance on the galactic scale, practically our next-door neighbor, a single radio message takes a century to arrive. A reply takes another century. You cannot negotiate a peace treaty or an alliance when multiple generations of citizens live, reproduce, and die between every single sentence. The sheer gap in communication time breeds an unbreakable, compounding chain of suspicion. You do not know what the other civilization is doing while the message is in transit. You do not know what advanced weaponry they are planning or building. And crucially, you do not know if they know that you are suspecting them. Combine this total communication blackout with the terrifying, historically proven reality of a technological explosion. Human progress is not linear, it is exponential. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors chased animals across the savannah with sharpened sticks, making almost zero technological progress. Then, in a span of just a few thousand years, we built monumental stone civilizations and mapped the movements of the stars. Then, in less than 2 centuries, we leapt from steam-powered engines to splitting the atom and walking on the moon. We cracked the fundamental codes of physics and biology in the blink of a cosmic eye. This exponential growth rate completely destroys the balance of power. If you, acting as an advanced, starfaring hunter in the dark forest, spot a seemingly primitive, biologically inferior civilization, let's say, a species just learning to formulate the theory of relativity, you might feel a surge of intellectual pity. You might think they are completely harmless to your grand empire. You might be tempted to leave them alone. But you cannot afford mercy. Because of the vast distances of space, the light reaching your telescopes is thousands of years old. By the time your observation returns to them, or by the time your diplomatic ship crosses the Gulf to greet them, their technology could have exploded into a singularity. The primitive, bumbling civilization you spared out of pity today could inherently possess weapons capable of annihilating your entire star system tomorrow. The hunter in the forest cannot logically employ mercy, because in the dark forest, technological leaps happen exponentially, turning yesterday's infants into tomorrow's ruthless executioners. The only safe biology is a dead biology. What would you do? This is not merely an academic question debated in university halls. It is the ultimate moral and existential quandary. If you held the button that could extinguish a distant star, a star that you know definitively harbors a civilization that might, eventually, become a threat to your homeworld, would you hesitate? If pressing that button was the only absolute guarantee of your children's continued survival, would you sink the knife into their backs in the dark? For decades, the standard scientific assumption, heavily promoted by optimistic visionaries like Carl Sagan, leaned on a deeply held, somewhat naive trope. Sagan fervently believed that highly advanced civilizations would be inherently peaceful. He passionately argued that any species aggressive enough to attack others would inevitably, mathematically destroy itself with its own weapons before it could achieve the technology required for interstellar travel. Therefore, Sagan concluded, the only ones who survive long enough to build starships must be benevolent, enlightened beings who have transcended the primitive urge for war. It is a beautiful thought. It is the very foundation of the Star Trek universe. But that optimism has faced severe, calculated, and terrifying pushback. Sociologist Robin Hanson presented a much darker evolutionary model based on the very principles that govern life on Earth. Aggressive expansion is a universal imperative of biology. Species that do not aggressively secure resources go extinct, outcompeted by those that do. Hansen argued that we have absolutely no empirical reason to believe this evolutionary biological imperative magically stops once a species leaves the atmosphere. Benevolence, he suggested, is a luxury of the completely unchallenged. Survival, on the other hand, requires ruthless, calculating pragmatism. The silence of the universe, when viewed through the cold lens of the dark forest theory, is no longer a puzzling absence of data. It is the data itself. The cosmic emptiness is empirical evidence. The universe is quiet specifically because it is a heavily populated graveyard. Every civilization that became loud, every species that arrogantly broadcasted its location, every bloated empire that built massive, glowing Dyson spheres that broadcast their infrared signatures across the galaxy, was swiftly, silently, and efficiently eradicated by a cautious, unseen hunter in the dark. The ones who survive are the ones who learn to hide from the very beginning, the ones who shut down their radios, cloak their thermal heat signatures, and hold their breath in the freezing void. But if the cosmos truly is a theater of paranoia, a place where survival demands blood and absolute silence, did our ancestors intuitively know this truth long before we built our first radio telescopes? Did the ancients look up at the seemingly peaceful stars and intuitively feel the cold, calculating gaze of the hunter staring back down at them? The historical record strongly suggests they did. They felt the dread in the marrow of their bones, and they paid the toll in blood trying to satisfy the silence. Tenochtitlan, the sprawling, magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire, built on the shimmering, shallow waters of Lake Texcoco, was a city of impossible geometry and bright, terrifying colors. In the year 1502, the air above the Great Central Pyramid was thick and heavy, laden with the sacred scent of burning copal resin and something much darker, far more metallic, the unmistakable, coppery smell of fresh blood baking relentlessly under the harsh Mesoamerican sun. Thousands of citizens moved through the bustling markets and the narrow causeways, their daily lives deeply intertwined with the cosmological demands of the empire. But on this specific evening, as the 52-year calendar cycle came to an agonizingly tense end, the greatest, most profound fear of the Aztec people was not the blood constantly poured onto the stone altars, but the crushing darkness creeping steadily across the sky. It was the terrifying, religiously imperative ceremony of the new fire. Every single flame in the vast valley of the empire was systematically, simultaneously extinguished by absolute decree. From the small hearths in the poorest, mud brick adobe homes to the massive, sacred braziers burning eternally atop the towering stone temples, the fires were put out. The entire city, and the millions of people living around the lake, plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness that mirrored the absolute void of deep space. The silence of the city was thick, broken only by the rhythmic, haunting chanting of the high priests as they scaled the steep, precipitous stairs of the Great Pyramid under a star-strewn sky. They were not looking at the moon, which they believed was the severed head of a goddess. They were watching the Pleiades star cluster, tracking its movement across the very zenith of the heavens with breathless anxiety. They believed with absolute, unwavering conviction that if the stars stopped moving, the world as they knew it would be violently, irreversibly unmade. In that terrifying stillness of the celestial dome, the Tzitzimitl, the star demons, skeletal, horrifying entities lurking just behind the darkness of the cosmos, would literally descend upon the earth. The Aztecs believed that these star demons would not arrive as conquerors seeking tribute or saviors offering enlightenment. They would descend merely to devour humanity, to consume the flesh of the living in a brutal apocalypse that would erase the fifth sun forever, obliterating everything they had built. The terror of the night sky was not an abstract, philosophical or cosmological concept debated in academies. It was an urgent, existential, and physical threat that demanded continuous, desperate, and bloody action. They believed they were currently living in the fifth sun, an era following four previous failed epochs that had inevitably and catastrophically ended in massive floods, raining fire, devastating hurricanes, and being eaten by jaguars. Their universe was not a serene, perfectly balanced clockwork mechanism designed by a benevolent creator. It was chaotic, violently unstable, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. The cosmos was a loaded weapon, a continuous threat forever waiting to happen. Imagine an Aztec high priest, adorned heavily in the magnificent, terrifying, and brightly colored regalia of a feathered serpent, his obsidian knife reflecting the faint glow of the stars on a moonless night. He stands rigidly before a captive, heavily tattooed warrior, the victim strapped firmly to the convex, blood-stained sacrificial stone. The captive knows the ritual intimately. He does not scream or thrash against the restraints. He understands his role as a fundamental, necessary biological component in the gruesome, mechanical machinery required to keep the universe turning. The priest, perhaps, turns to a visiting noble from a newly conquered province, or maybe even to the early, horrified Spanish conquistadors who would meticulously document these scenes years later. "You look up at us and see nothing but monsters and butchers," the priest might say, his voice echoing over the silent, completely dark city, waiting in absolute terror for the new fire to be kindled in the chest cavity of a sacrificial victim. "You see the rivers of blood and you call us savages, but you do not understand the mechanics of the sky. Without the blood, the sun physically stops, and if the sun stops, the stars come down to eat us. We do not do this for sadistic pleasure. We do this to hold the sky together. We do this because the universe demands it." The highly ritualized, systematic practice of human sacrifice was the Aztec civilization's frantic, desperate attempt to pay the cosmic debt, to delay the inevitable destruction that they knew with absolute certainty circled them in the endless black void. It was their way of holding back the hunters in the dark forest. In their deeply entrenched theology, the Tzitzimitl, the skeletal star demons with clawed feet and skull faces, were a primitive mythological interpretation of very real cosmic threats. Today, we call those threats asteroids plummeting from the Kuiper Belt, catastrophic solar flares, obliterating gamma-ray bursts, or perhaps the hostile, expanding, and technologically superior alien empires that the dark forest theory predicts. The deep, resonant psychological parallel between Aztec dread and modern cosmological paranoia is strikingly profound. To the Aztecs, the sky was not a beautiful heaven of benevolent gods watching over them. It was a vast, open theater of potential chaos and absolute annihilation. We look back at Mesoamerican civilizations with a sense of modern, enlightened superiority. We view their human sacrifices as the ultimate expression of primitive brutality, the fanaticism of a society that fundamentally misunderstood the laws of physics and the vast emptiness of the cosmos. We think we are so fundamentally, morally different from the men who offered beating human hearts to a thirsty, dying sun. But are we really? We build incredibly deep, reinforced concrete nuclear bunkers miles inside hollowed-out mountains, instead of monumental limestone step pyramids. We aim sleek, hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missiles at the sky, instead of ritually polished obsidian blades. We dedicate colossal portions of our global economic surplus to massive defense budgets, trying desperately to stave off an annihilation that we know is terrifyingly possible at any given moment. The fundamental fear of sudden, total extinction, remains absolutely identical. The only difference is the vocabulary we use to describe the demons and the technology we deploy to keep them at bay. Modern ethnohistorians, anthropologists, and archaeologists have finally begun to peeling back the layers of colonial prejudice to examine the psychological core of Aztec cosmology. Inga Clendenin, a profound and insightful scholar of Mesoamerican history, offered a radically different, empathetic perspective on the sheer magnitude of the bloodshed in Tenochtitlan. She analyzed the socio-religious structure not as a sadistic cult of cruelty, but as a traumatized society reacting logically to a perceived, overwhelmingly hostile environment. They did not sacrifice out of sheer cruelty or malice, Clendenin argued powerfully in her analysis of Aztec ritual behavior, but out of a terrifying, overwhelming, and deeply internalized sense of cosmic responsibility. The Aztecs lived in a geologically unstable, treacherous region, subject to devastating, prolonged droughts, massive tectonic earthquakes, and catastrophic volcanic eruptions from the Ring of Fire. Their religion was a direct mirror, reflecting the harshness and unpredictability of their physical reality. They recognized instinctively that the natural world, and by direct extension the entire surrounding cosmos, was entirely capable of wiping them out without a second thought. Their worldview was brutal, blood-soaked, and harsh, but perhaps, when viewed through the cold, calculating, and unsentimental lens of the modern dark forest theory, it was infinitely more realistic than our modern, highly optimistic Star Trek fantasies of a benevolent, peaceful universe filled with friendly interstellar neighbors eager to share their technology. The Aztecs understood, intimately and biologically, that survival was not a guaranteed human right. It was a temporary, highly precarious state that had to be fiercely, continuously defended against overwhelming odds. The silence of the universe, the unblinking, cold stare of the stars from the night sky, was not peaceful to them. It was a constant, haunting reminder of the darkness that surrounded their fragile, temporary fire. The world of the fifth sun did incredibly end, but not by star demons physically descending from the Pleiades cluster. It ended with the arrival of Toledo steel swords, the devastating invisible plague of smallpox, and the apocalyptic, bloody clash with Spanish galleons. The Aztec civilization was eradicated completely by a threat they could never have anticipated, a vast technological gap they could not cross, demonstrating the very core premise of the dark forest. Superior civilizations do not negotiate, they conquer. Their profound fears of sudden annihilation were entirely justified. They just looked to the sky for the threat instead of the sea. Yet the intuitive, deep-seated human dread of the cosmos, the biological, evolutionary recognition that the sky is inherently dangerous, was not confined merely to the Valley of Mexico. The belief that the heavens could literally tear themselves open and rain fire upon humanity was a global phenomenon, stitched inextricably into the cultural DNA of almost every civilization on Earth. And sometimes, the threat appeared to be terrifyingly real, manifesting in ways that even the most grounded, empirical historians still struggle to fully explain. Half a world away from the blood-stained altars of Tenochtitlan, and mere decades after the brutal fall of the Aztec Empire, the heavens over a quiet, industrious German city would explode in an undeniable, maddening conflict that would leave thousands completely trembling in the streets. The terrified residents of Nuremberg would look up at the bright morning sun, and they would see exactly what the Aztec priests had always feared: the sky physically going to war. Dawn broke over the imperial free city of Nuremberg on April 14, 1561. The air was crisp, holding the bitter remnant of a German winter, but the sky was remarkably clear. Thousands of citizens, from the wealthiest patricians in their grand timber-framed houses to the poorest laborers heading toward the tanner's district, stepped out into the pale morning light. They expected a routine Tuesday, filled with the clatter of carts, the ringing of church bells, and the smell of roasting meats and open sewers. Instead, as the sun began to lift itself above the horizon, they witnessed a spectacle so horrifying, so completely incomprehensible to the 16th century mind, that the trauma of the morning would be etched into the historical record forever. The sun itself seemed to bleed. According to the mass of breathless eyewitness accounts that flooded the city, two enormous, blood-red arcs framed the rising sun, burning with an intense, unearthly light. But that was only the beginning. As the citizens of Nuremberg shielded their eyes and stared upward, the sky erupted into absolute chaos. They watched, frozen in terror, as the heavens filled with a bizarre menagerie of impossible shapes. Cylindrical objects, which terrified observers described as massive gun barrels or gigantic pipes, materialized out of thin air. From inside these cylinders emerged scores of violently colored spheres, blood red, bluish, and the deepest iron black. They swarmed out like enraged wasps from a hive, darting across the sky in erratic, aggressive patterns that defied the wind and any known laws of nature. Then came the crosses. Enormous, blood-red crosses appeared amid the spheres, hanging in the air with terrifying stillness before lunging forward. And finally, traversing the entire chaotic scene, were massive, black, spear-like shapes, thick at the base and tapering to a deadly point. For a full hour, this terrifying armada engaged in what looked unambiguously like a ferocious, chaotic battle. The spheres darted back and forth, colliding, retreating, and flashing with intense light. The black spears swept through the formations like colossal weapons of war. We know the intimate details of this event not from vague rumors, but because a local printer named Hans Glaser documented the entire phenomenon in a highly detailed broadsheet. In an era long before mass media, the broadsheet was the equivalent of breaking news, printed quickly and distributed widely to a population hungry for information. Glaser's broadsheet, which survives today in the archives of the Zentralbibliothek Zurich, includes a vivid, hand-colored woodcut illustration of the sky filled with fighting shapes, plunging spheres, and a massive black triangle dominating the center of the conflict. Glaser's accompanying text is a mixture of meticulous reportage and terrified religious interpretation. He describes the hour-long conflict with the precision of a military observer. He noted that the spheres and crosses fought vehemently, that some were vanquished, and that many seemed to crash out of the sky in a blaze of fire. Slowly, as the conflict reached its climax, the objects reportedly grew exhausted. Eyewitnesses claimed they saw several of the objects plummeting toward the earth outside the city walls, fading into a thick, billowing smoke, as if consumed by some unnatural fire. The interpretation of the event was immediate and absolute. To the deeply religious, fiercely divided population of mid-century Germany, a region already traumatized by the brutal religious wars of the Reformation, this was not an astronomical anomaly. This was a direct, terrifying message from a wrathful God. Whatever such signs mean, God alone knows, Glaser wrote, his prose reflecting the profound anxiety of his readers. Although we have seen, shortly one after another, many kinds of signs in the heavens, which are sent to us by the Almighty God to bring us to repentance, we still are, unfortunately, so blind and heartless that we take no notice of them. We will bring God's terrifying wrath upon ourselves. This was not a few isolated lunatics staring into the sun too long. This was a mass observation of something incomprehensible, witnessed by thousands of seemingly rational people spread across a major European city. It was an event so profound that the local authorities debated how to handle the inevitable panic, while priests and pastors used the broadsheet as ammunition for apocalyptic sermons. Centuries later, modern science has attempted to dissect the Nuremberg event, stripping away the religious terror to find a rational, meteorological explanation. The most common and accepted theory is that the citizens of Nuremberg witnessed an exceptionally rare and intense display of parhelia, commonly known as sun dogs. Sun dogs are an atmospheric optical phenomenon caused by the refraction of sunlight through hexagonal ice crystals suspended in high, cold cirrus clouds. They can create brilliant, colorful halos, vivid arcs of light, and bright patches flanking the sun. In extreme circumstances, multiple optical phenomena, including the parhelic circle, circumzenithal arcs, and light pillars, can combine to create a dizzying complex of celestial geometry. When you add the natural human tendency for pareidolia, the psychological phenomenon that causes people to see recognizable shapes and patterns, like faces or familiar objects in random data, the explanation seems plausible. The cylinders were light pillars, the spheres were sun dogs, the crosses were intersecting halos. The movement was the rapid shifting of the clouds and the changing angle of the rising sun. The crashing objects outside the city were likely the sudden dissipation of range shafts or distant meteors, perfectly timed to coincide with the atmospheric display. The famous Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung took a different analytical approach in his 1958 book, Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. Jung examined the Nuremberg broadsheet not as a meteorological report, but as a profound psychological document. He argued that the event was a mass hallucination, a projection of the collective unconscious. The people of 16th century Germany were living through a period of intense religious conflict, social upheaval, and constant warfare. Jung posited that their deep-seated internal anxieties, their subconscious fears of destruction and divine judgment, were quite literally projected onto an ambiguous atmospheric phenomenon. They looked up at a complex display of ice crystals and saw the war that was tearing their world apart mirrored back at them by the heavens. But what if it wasn't a meteor? What if, purely as an exercise in existential dread, the people of Nuremberg witnessed something far stranger? What if they witnessed the aftermath of a cosmic skirmish, hidden behind the blinding light of the morning sun and the distortion of the atmosphere? We imagine a terrified weaver standing in the cobblestone streets, grasping his wife's hand, pointing to the sky with a trembling finger. "Do you see them?" he whispers, his voice barely audible over the panicked shouting of the crowd. "They are fighting over us, and neither side cares if we burn. We are just ants beneath their boots." This is where the Nuremberg event, regardless of its true cause, perfectly encapsulates the emotional and psychological core of the dark forest theory. Whether it was ice crystals, a mass hallucination, or an actual, incomprehensible interstellar engagement occurring in the upper atmosphere, the psychological impact was identical. The people of Nuremberg looked up and realized they were utterly powerless. They recognized that the sky was a theater of forces so vastly superior, so terrifyingly indifferent to human existence, that their only recourse was to drop to their knees and pray for mercy. They understood instinctively that they were bystanders in a universe operating on scales and motives they could never hope to fathom. If the cosmos is a dark forest, filled with advanced, predatory civilizations quietly hunting each other, it is entirely possible that conflicts occasionally flare up. In the inconceivably vast expanses of deep space, an interstellar war might consist of silent, relativistic strikes, the launching of self-replicating von Neumann probes, or the casual, instantaneous destruction of entire star systems. If such a skirmish happened to spill over into our immediate neighborhood, how would we perceive it? We would not see sleek, silver spacecraft trading laser fire like a Hollywood movie. We would likely see something that defied our understanding of physics. We would see geometric shapes. We would see brutal, silent flashes of radiation. We would see things that looked like magic or divine wrath. We would see exactly what Hans Glaser drew on his broadsheet in 1561. The Nuremberg event illustrates the fundamental vulnerability of the human condition. It is a historical testament to the primal fear that the sky is not a protective blanket, but an open window to an incredibly dangerous wilderness. The citizens of Nuremberg went back to their lives. The panic subsided. The broadsheets were filed away, but the psychological scar remained. They knew, as the Aztecs knew, that the silence of the night sky was deceptive. If the sky truly is a battlefield, filled with the debris and the silent weaponry of incredibly advanced hunters, why haven't we been destroyed yet? If the dark forest is real, and the universe is teeming with civilizations desperate to eliminate potential rivals, why has Earth been spared? The answer to that question might be the single most depressing, terrifying concept in modern astrophysics. It is a concept that suggests our greatest threat is not a hostile alien armada, but a quiet, invisible barrier that we are blindly racing toward. We are approaching the edge of the forest, and we are about to meet the great filter. The absolute, unyielding silence of the cosmos is not a peaceful, meditative quiet designed to soothe the human soul. It feels instead like wandering slowly, apprehensively into a sprawling, grandly architecture, yet completely abandoned mansion where the dining tables are immaculately set for dinner. The crystal chandeliers are blazing with electric light. The fireplaces are roaring, but all the massive oak doors are securely locked from the inside, and not a single living soul is breathing anywhere in the house. It is a cosmological crime scene of unimaginable proportions, where the billions of potential victims have been meticulously, cleanly vaporized without a single trace. This chilling, inescapable realization was what forcefully struck Robin Hansen, an esteemed economist and theoretical astrobiologist affiliated deeply with George Mason University, and Oxford's profoundly forward-thinking Future of Humanity Institute. In the late, humid summer of 1996, Hansen was wrestling internally with the stark, unyielding mathematics of the observable universe. He rigorously reviewed the mountains of astronomical data available at the time, the sheer, mind-numbing scale of planetary systems surrounding almost every star, the statistical probability, and the seemingly inevitable chemical emergence of complex, self-replicating molecules on watery worlds. He stared incessantly at the glaring contradictions stacked high in his quiet academic office, feeling the intellectual cold of deep space settling permanently into his bones. "There is a filter in place," he might have whispered aloud in the sterile quiet of his office, the realization coalescing rapidly into a horrifying, comprehensive theory that would eventually shake the foundation of SETI. And the terrifying thing is, we simply don't know, and cannot mathematically prove if that filter is safely behind us in our evolutionary past, or directly, unavoidably right in front of us in our technological future. This paradigm-shifting realization officially birthed the concept widely known today as the Great Filter. It is a highly robust theory that attempts to answer Enrico Fermi's nagging lunchtime question: Where is everybody? Not with the active, predatory paranoia of Liu Cixin's dark forest, but with an equally terrifying mechanism of sheer cosmological probability and evolutionary dead ends. The Great Filter theory suggests that the evolutionary path from a barren, lifeless, cooling rock floating in space to a highly advanced, galaxy-spanning interstellar civilization is definitely not a smooth, inevitable curve of continuous progress. It is, conversely, a brutal, deadly, incredibly complex obstacle course composed of numerous, extraordinarily difficult evolutionary steps. The journey begins with the highly improbable emergence of self-replicating chemical molecules in a primordial soup on a primitive Earth. Then comes the massive leap to actual single-celled life forms, followed by the incredibly rare, biologically inexplicable jump to complex, multicellular organisms through mitochondrial assimilation. Then sexual reproduction, which supercharges genetic diversity. Then the evolution of an energetically expensive brain capable of high-level abstract thought, complex language, and the manipulation of physical tools. And finally, the ultimate technological leaps, the rapid creation of science, global industrialization, the splitting of the atom, and the immensely difficult jump to sustainable space infrastructure. Hansen theorized profoundly that at least one of these critical steps is an almost insurmountable, practically impossible barrier. This specific, unknown barrier is the Great Filter. It operates continuously like a cosmic brick wall, a universal exterminator that inevitably annihilates or permanently halts almost every single species before they can ever possibly reach the necessary technological threshold for widespread interstellar travel and radio communication. The filter is the exact reason the universe looks so completely, utterly dead, because practically everything in the universe is, in fact, dead. The truly terrifying crux of the Great Filter theory hinges entirely on discovering precisely where humanity sits relative to this invisible, civilization-ending wall. It forces our entire species into a binary, inescapable existential trap with only two equally chilling outcomes. Scenario 1. The Great Filter is safely behind us. Perhaps the biological jump from simple, nucleus-free prokaryotic cells to highly complex eukaryotic cells with a packaged nucleus was an unbelievable trillion-to-one cosmological fluke that almost never happens. It took life on Earth billions of agonizingly slow years just to figure that single step out, lingering in the oceans as simple, unthinking slime for eons before the Cambrian explosion. If this scenario is true, then humanity is the freak biological accident of the observable universe. We are the unbelievably lucky ones who somehow, miraculously, slip through the incredibly fine mesh of the filter. We look up at an empty, silent sky because we truly, fundamentally are the first, or perhaps the only ones to make it this far. The profound responsibility of conscious thought, the preservation of the only flame of awareness in the entire galaxy, rests entirely, terrifyingly, solely upon our fragile human shoulders. Scenario 2. The Great Filter is situated ominously in front of us. This is where the Great Filter theory turns deeply, immediately apocalyptic. If the biological emergence of life is common across the stars, and if the natural evolutionary development of intelligence is also relatively common, but we still see absolutely no physical or radio evidence of advanced, starfaring civilizations anywhere, then the math dictates a horrifying conclusion. It means that literally every single civilization that reaches our current level of technological competence swiftly, unavoidably, and inevitably hits a wall they cannot climb. It implies strongly that almost all intelligent species eventually, mechanically trigger their own total extinction long before they can effectively colonize the neighboring stars and spread their biological footprint. This deeply pessimistic logic leads to a highly counterintuitive conclusion regarding our ongoing missions to Mars, Europa, Enceladus, and the continued search for extraterrestrial biological life within our own solar system. If the Perseverance rover digs deep into the Martian permafrost tomorrow and uncovers a simple, fossilized bacterium, it is an interesting, perhaps groundbreaking scientific and biological discovery. But if the rover digs a little deeper into the red dust and accidentally uncovers the complex, fossilized remains of a multicellular organism, a primitive fish, a hard-shelled insect, or, God forbid, the crumbling, radioactive ruins of a finely carved stone building, it would undeniably be the absolute worst news in the entire history of human consciousness. The complete silence of the night sky is golden, Hansen famously wrote, articulating the horror of the filter, and the actual physical discovery of simple life on Mars, or complex life anywhere else in our immediate vicinity, would be a devastating blow to our future. It would definitively prove that the incredibly hard steps of biological evolution are not the filter. It would mean the filter is, without a doubt, waiting for us ahead. It would mean we are, inevitably and very quickly, marching straight into the cosmic meat grinder. If we accept the horrifying possibility that the great filter is situated directly ahead of us in the timeline of human development, what exactly does that apocalyptic wall look like? How does a supposedly intelligent, highly capable civilization routinely, dependably, and guaranteed destroy itself completely? Look closely at recent human history for the terrifying answers. We almost annihilated our entire species, incinerating everything we have ever built, over a simple piece of faulty computer hardware in a matter of desperate, panic-stricken seconds. Picture the early hours of September 26, 1983. A highly classified, deeply buried Soviet early warning military bunker situated discreetly outside Moscow, known only as Serpukhov 15. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is the duty officer placed precisely in charge of constantly monitoring the brand new, highly complex orbital satellite systems, specifically designed to detect an incoming, preemptive American nuclear strike. The geopolitical situation surrounding him is highly volatile, balanced constantly on a razor's edge. Tensions between the two superpowers are the absolute highest they have been since the terrifying days of the Cuban Missile Crisis over 2 decades prior. Suddenly, the harsh, electronic alarms in the quiet bunker scream to life. The automated computer system, designated OCO, clearly, graphically, and unambiguously reports on the massive digital displays that an American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile has launched from a silo in the United States. Then, within seconds, it definitively reports another, and another. Soon, the glowing red system map shows 5 distinct nuclear missiles streaking rapidly across the northern hemisphere toward the Soviet Union. The military protocol is absolute, drilled into every officer's head. Petrov is required by his sworn duty to immediately pick up the direct line and report an incoming, confirmed nuclear strike to the high command. That simple, immediate phone call would automatically trigger an instantaneous, total, overwhelming retaliatory launch from the entire Soviet nuclear triad. The result would be absolute, unavoidable World War III. Global thermonuclear winter would follow. The end of human civilization, permanently erasing our name from the galactic record in less than 45 minutes. Petrov stands frozen, staring intensely at the screaming red sirens and the flashing launch indicators on his console. He has only agonizingly few minutes to definitively verify the launch before the American missiles, if real, would begin detonating over Soviet cities. But amidst the sheer, overwhelming panic, he notices something deeply odd, a tiny inconsistency in the data. The ground-based radar systems, which track physical objects coming over the curve of the Earth's horizon, show absolutely nothing in the sky. He must make an impossibly heavy, species-altering decision based entirely on his gut human instinct, rather than trusting the multi-million-dollar, state-of-the-art computer system. "I will not start the end of the world for a computer glitch," Petrov aggressively reasoned with his panicked subordinates, gripping the edges of the console monitors so hard his knuckles turned white, directly defying his strict military standing orders. He picked up the secure, bright red phone connected directly to Army headquarters and decisively reported a system malfunction, not a strike. For 20 agonizing, silent, sweat-drenched minutes, he sat heavily in the command bunker, waiting in pure terror to see if a massive nuclear detonation would suddenly vaporize him and his entire country. It was miraculously a catastrophic computer error. Bizarrely aligned high-altitude clouds reflecting intense sunlight had completely blinded and confused the orbital satellites, mimicking the bright thermal flash of a missile launch. A complete, unadulterated false alarm. Humanity narrowly dodged the great filter by the absolute slimmest of margins, saved only by the skeptical instinct of a single man sitting in a concrete bunker, utterly refusing to unquestioningly follow protocol. But statistically speaking, how many times can a developing civilization roll those apocalyptic dice before they inevitably land on snake eyes? Nuclear weapons are a primary, incredibly strong candidate for the Great Filter, but there are countless others waiting in the wings of technological development. The rapid, unchecked acceleration of artificial intelligence could easily spawn a cold, calculating superintelligence that views its biological, inefficient creators as obsolete, resource-consuming pests that need to be aggressively exterminated. Alternatively, the development of advanced, self-replicating nanobots, the dreaded gray goo scenario, could catastrophically malfunction, rapidly multiplying and consuming all available planetary biomass, including humans, turning the entire Earth into a lifeless sphere of atomic dust in a matter of days. Engineered, highly virulent biological pandemics, far deadlier than anything found in nature, could be released accidentally or intentionally by a relatively primitive, poorly secured research lab. Extreme, completely uncontrolled runaway climate change induced by rapid, blind industrialization could boil the oceans and poison the atmosphere long before a species manages to invent the necessary orbital mirrors or carbon sequestration technologies required to save themselves. Perhaps the dark forest is real, but the hunters aren't malevolent, hyper-advanced aliens sweeping aggressively through the galaxy in slick, heavily armed massive black warships. Perhaps the hunters are the civilizations themselves, committing an inevitable technological suicide through their own short-sighted inventions before they ever develop the capacity to hear another voice in the dark. They inadvertently lock all the planetary doors from the inside, turn on the poisonous gas stove of industrialization and war, and silently suffocate on their own brilliant achievements before anyone outside can even attempt to knock. And yet, despite the incredibly high, empirically observable risk of the filter, despite the suffocating, terrifying paranoia of the dark forest theory screaming at us to remain quietly hidden, humanity stubbornly decided it wasn't nearly enough to just passively listen to the silence. In a spectacular display of either breathtaking scientific optimism or staggering, suicidal, evolutionary arrogance, we collectively decided to step boldly onto the cosmic stage, clear our throats loudly, and shine a brilliant, high-powered electromagnetic flashlight straight into the dangerous dark. On November 16, 1974, a low, powerful mechanical hum vibrated steadily through the lush, emerald-green, incredibly dense jungle of Puerto Rico. The Arecibo Observatory, a colossal, magnificent bowl-shaped radio telescope nestled snugly and permanently into a natural limestone sinkhole in the karst landscape, was meticulously preparing to do something entirely unprecedented in human history. It was remarkably designed to listen, picking up the faintest whispers of cosmic static from the deepest reaches of space. But on this humid day, the dish was preparing to speak. It was preparing to shout at the top of its electromagnetic lungs. Frank Drake, the visionary man who had mathematically formalized the existential terror of the Fermi Paradox into an agonizing, predictive equation 13 long years earlier, stood nervously alongside a towering, highly articulate figure of 20th century scientific optimism, the esteemed astronomer Carl Sagan. The two astrophysicists, pioneers of SETI, were closely surrounded by an entourage of brilliant engineers, observing dignitaries from the scientific community, and the heavy, moisture-laden air of the Caribbean afternoon. They were, incredibly, about to broadcast the most powerful, concentrated radio signal ever deliberately generated by human hands, taking aim straight at the very heart of the M13 globular star cluster, an intensely dense, gravitationally bound swarm of roughly 300,000 extremely ancient stars located near the outermost, freezing edge of our home galaxy. They had carefully, painstakingly crafted an interstellar message, translating the fundamental realities of human biology, our basic numerical counting system, the precise atomic structure of essential elements necessary for life, the complex double helix structure of our unique DNA, the rough, pixelated physical shape of a human being, and crucially, a detailed map of our local solar system with the Earth conspicuously, proudly highlighted. All of this data was compressed into a tight, binary cascade of exactly 1,679 ones and zeros. It was a mathematical hello, designed to cut through the universal noise. A cosmic, blindly launched reaching out across the void. An interstellar, beautifully optimistic greeting card sent careening across 25,000 light years of completely empty, incredibly dangerous space. As the massive, complex machinery of the dish roared deafeningly to life above the jungle canopy, beaming an astonishing 3 trillion watts of effective radiated power into the black void in a single, tightly focused, pencil-thin beam, Drake reportedly felt a profound, overwhelming sense of scientific awe. He believed deeply that he had just managed to throw a brilliantly constructed message inside a bottle into the chaotic currents of the great cosmic ocean. But when viewed specifically from the cold, hyper-paranoid perspective of the dark forest theory, the Arecibo Observatory was definitely not functioning as an enlightened beacon of mutual hope. It was functioning exactly like a blinding, highly visible flare gun fired desperately by a terrified, foolish, lost child deeply embedded in a lightless jungle packed shoulder to shoulder with unseen, ravenous predators. It was the loudest, most incredibly suicidal signal mathematically imaginable. The Arecibo message, despite its staggering implications, was definitely not an isolated freak incident of scientific overreach. It was merely the first aggressive act in a much larger, surprisingly persistent and deeply ingrained human desire, or rather, a biological compulsion, to be known and remembered by the cosmos. Just 3 short years later, in the late summer of 1977, a heavily funded NASA confidently launched the twin Voyager probes, ambitious robotic emissaries designed specifically to explore the furthest, darkest reaches of the outer solar system before permanently leaving the sun's gravitational pull. Securely bolted to the side of each fragile spacecraft, protected from the ravages of micrometeorites by a sturdy aluminum jacket, was a physical phonograph record, a 12-inch, thickly gold-plated copper disc containing the legendary Voyager Golden Record. Carefully curated by a dedicated committee passionately chaired by Carl Sagan, the gleaming Golden Record was deliberately intended to act as a permanent time capsule, an exhaustive summary of humanity's finest achievements sent on a lonely, one-way trip into the unforgiving depths of interstellar space. It contained 55 spoken, heartfelt greetings recorded in different human languages, ranging from ancient Sumerian to modern English. It featured the intimate, highly emotional sound of a mother's first kiss on her newborn baby's cheek, the translated electrical brainwaves of a young woman deeply in love, masterpieces of classical music composed by Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, the intense, rhythmic pounding of a Navajo night chant, and an incredibly encyclopedic collection of finely etched images. These images boldly depicted detailed human anatomy, our sprawling urban architecture, and most controversially, our precise, triangulated galactic location relative to 14 highly specific, easily identifiable pulsars acting as cosmic lighthouses. "This is a present from a small, distant world," read the official, highly optimistic message from then U.S. President Jimmy Carter, included in the physical data on the record. "A token of our sounds, our science, our images, our music, our thoughts, and our feelings. We are attempting to survive our time so we may live into yours." It was a beautiful, deeply touching, profoundly human gesture of incredible, monumental scientific optimism. But it was also an incredibly naive, highly detailed broadcast of our absolute biological vulnerabilities, our precise physical makeup, and fundamentally, our home address. It was essentially the equivalent of drawing a massive, highly visible, neon-targeting reticle squarely on our own unarmored foreheads for any advanced civilization possessing a high-powered telescope. The rapidly developing idea of METI, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, also known widely in the astronomical community as active SETI, has ignited an absolute firestorm of controversy, fear, and aggressive debate within the ranks of the scientific, philosophical, and global military communities over the past several decades. For many years, we were primarily safely practicing passive SETI, quietly listening with our giant parabolic dishes for a faint whisper in the dark, remaining safely hidden in the tall grass. But the sudden, arrogant shift toward actively, loudly shouting into the pitch-black abyss raised horrifying, deeply existential questions. Stephen Hawking, widely regarded as one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists in modern human history, was famously, unequivocally, and aggressively opposed to any form of METI. In 2010, the brilliant, paralyzed genius used his iconic electronic voice synthesizer to deliver a stark, terrifying warning on a globally broadcast Discovery Channel documentary. For an advanced, much older civilization, listening to our radio signals is incredibly easy. But if such aliens visit us, the outcome would be much as when Christopher Columbus violently landed in America. which definitively didn't turn out very well for the Native Americans, Hawking stated, his flat, synthesized voice cutting sharply through the often naive, overly optimistic din of the astronomical community. We only have to look at ourselves, to our own bloody, terrible history of conquest and genocide on Earth, to see how highly intelligent life might easily develop into something we absolutely wouldn't want to meet in the dark. By willingly giving away our spatial coordinates, Hawking forcefully argued, we are completely violating the absolute first, undeniable rule of the dark forest. Do not ever reveal your position to a superior force. Do not ever assume, without proof, that the unknown entity receiving the message shares your human morality, your specific ethics, or your altruistic values. Do not assume they have miraculously outgrown war, conquest, or the biological imperative of resource acquisition. Do not assume they will view you as a fascinating, equal partner in cosmic dialogue, rather than a usable raw resource, a biological pest, or, most terrifyingly, a rapidly developing potential future threat that must be efficiently, preemptively neutralized before it becomes dangerous. Imagine, vividly, that you are lost alone in a massive, dense, unfamiliar, pitch-black jungle late at night. You are freezing cold, physically terrified, and acutely, paralyzingly aware that vicious nocturnal leopards and heavily armed, ruthless paramilitaries are known definitively to patrol the immediate area. Suddenly, you hear a sharp, distinct twig snap loudly nearby. Do you instantly, foolishly light a brilliant, blindingly bright red magnesium flare, hold it high above your head, illuminating your unarmored body, and yell your name into the trees, hoping against all rational hope that the twig was snapped by a friendly, well-equipped rescue party? Or do you drop perfectly still into the wet mud, hold your breath until your lungs physically burn for oxygen, and wait, knowing with absolute, terrifying biological certainty that the tiger actively hunts blindly by sound? The debate raging between the proponents of active messaging and the deeply concerned proponents of absolute radio silence is incredibly fierce and uncompromising. It is not merely a polite, academic disagreement discussed over tea. It is a critical, high-stakes debate concerning the very ultimate survival of the entire human species. Astrophysicist and science fiction author David Brin is one of the most vocal, articulate critics of METI. He passionately argues that a small, unelected, entirely unrepresentative group of enthusiastic radio astronomers has absolutely no moral or legal right to gamble the fate, existence, and future of an entire planet based on an optimistic, unproven theological assumption about the inherent goodness of the universe. You are recklessly betting the continued physical existence of all future unborn human generations on the completely unfounded assumption that the incredibly violent universe is inherently benign and governed gently by altruistic, peaceful angels. Brin often argues aggressively in high-profile debates concerning active SETI. That is absolutely not empirical science. That is an act of blind, profoundly stupid theology. You are screaming at the top of your lungs into a terrifying, massive, lightless jungle we do not even begin to understand. And if something massive out there hears you, turns its head and begins walking in your direction, you cannot rapidly take the message back. The bullet has left the gun. But the dire warning, unfortunately, may be entirely too late. We have absolutely not been quiet. Since the early days of inventing high-powered radar in the late 1930s, the first, incredibly powerful commercial television broadcasts pumping out episodes of I Love Lucy in the 1940s and 1950s, and the massive, escalating deployment of incredibly powerful early warning phased array military radar systems built during the paranoia of the Cold War. Earth has been continuously leaking an ever-expanding, spherical wave of dense electromagnetic radiation. That rapidly expanding sphere, our terrestrial radio bubble, is now approximately 100 light-years across. It securely encompasses thousands upon thousands of neighboring star systems. If anyone within 100 light-years is currently listening with sufficiently sensitive, massive antennas, they already know we are undeniably here. They have clearly heard the garbled transmission of Hitler's opening speech at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. They have heard the tense, triumphant launch codes and telemetry of the Apollo space missions. They have heard the endless, deafening, chaotic static of our global military and commercial communications. The concentrated Arecibo message itself is currently racing uncontrollably through the cold vacuum of interstellar space exactly at the blistering speed of light. It has been traveling outward for nearly 50 complete years. The bullet has left the chamber. The flare has been lit, and it cannot be extinguished. The explicit information, our biology, our exact location, our terrifyingly rapid technological adolescence, is irreversibly washing out in a massive wave into the deep, unforgiving black. We can only sit in the dark and wait anxiously for the echo to return. We can only wait for centuries to verify if the dark forest is truly, completely empty of threats, or if something ancient heard the message, paused its activities, coldly calculated our exact spatial coordinates from the pulsar map deliberately provided on the Voyager record, and quietly, efficiently began preparing an appropriate response. And the truly terrifying, inescapable truth is that decades ago, while we arrogantly strained our massive, highly sensitive mechanical ears listening for faint radio waves echoing from deep space, we actually, genuinely thought we heard the response. A single, blazing, unbelievably powerful signal cut cleanly through the cosmic background noise so intensely, so sharply, that it sent massive shockwaves through the rigid scientific establishment, only to vanish completely and forever, leaving us suspended for decades in agonizing, terrifying ambiguity. It happened in the sweltering summer of 1977, and for exactly 72 agonizingly slow seconds, the universe screamed violently back. It was the sweltering, humid, unbearably stagnant summer afternoon of August 15, 1977, in the quiet, unassuming college town of Delaware, Ohio. Jerry Amon, a dedicated volunteer radio researcher, deeply meticulous astronomer, and mathematician tirelessly working for the chronically underfunded SETI project, sat comfortably in the quiet solitude of his modest home, sipping a lukewarm cup of filtered coffee. He was a deeply precise, analytical man, specifically tasked by the university with a mind-numbingly tedious, incredibly repetitive job that required monastic patience, meticulously reviewing the endless reams of continuous computer printouts violently generated day and night by the massive Big Ear radio telescope located heavily at the Ohio State University Perkins Observatory. The telescope itself was not a classic, gleaming parabolic dish pointing dramatically into space. It was essentially an unimaginably massive, flat wire mesh grid, lying flush on the ground like a colossal, metallic football field, constantly, mechanically sweeping a narrow strip of the sky precisely as the physical Earth continuously rotated on its axis. It was ceaselessly, blindly searching for any distinct, recognizable, or repeating anomalies buried deep within the chaotic, ubiquitous cosmic microwave background radiation. Specifically, It was painstakingly listening for anything that didn't sound exactly and predictably like the chaotic, hissing, meaningless static of ancient, dying stars, expanding molecular nebulae, and the lingering echoes of the Big Bang. Eamon's trained, weary eyes scanned the fanfold, perforated green and white striped paper printouts. The incoming astronomical data was brilliantly, purely represented as a long, tedious column of alphanumeric characters, functioning as a bizarre, visually dense code, where numbers precisely ranging 1 through 9 represented linearly increasing signal intensity, and letters A through Z represented even higher, blindingly loud, exponentially scaling levels of radio interference, hitting the massive antenna. For many grueling hours, his eyes drifted over endless, boring rows of 1s, 2s, and occasional, uninteresting 3s. This was the usual, expected galactic whisper, the mundane, chaotic background noise of the physical universe groaning and stretching in the dark. Suddenly, a distinct sequence leaped violently off the monotonous page, instantly shattering the dull rhythm of the printout. It wasn't just slightly, marginally louder than the background noise. It was a massive, cleanly defined explosion of organized, highly concentrated electromagnetic energy. Eamon stopped breathing. The coffee cup hovered halfway to his mouth, completely forgotten in his trembling hand. He aggressively grabbed a bright red pen lying on the messy kitchen table, hurriedly uncapped it with a satisfying click, and excitedly, deeply circled a single, prominent vertical sequence of precisely 6 characters that stood out starkly like a blazing, towering bonfire in the middle of a pitch-dark, freezing desert night. 6EQUJ5. The signal intensity started completely low at a baseline 6, skyrocketed dizzyingly fast to an E, blasted incredibly to a peaking Q and a massive U, dropped slightly but noticeably to a J over the next few seconds, and finally, cleanly trailed off at a fading 5 before vanishing back into the endless, hissing sea of static. He stared intently, almost obsessively, at the thick red circle drawn frantically on the cheap computer paper. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, electrified by the impossible implications of what he was physically holding. The oppressive silence of his small suburban kitchen felt suddenly heavy, completely suffused with the unimaginable, terrifying vastness of deep space. Driven by an uncontrollable, visceral surge of profound shock, scientific panic, and absolute awe, he quickly wrote a single, highly emotional word directly in the margin right next to the circled sequence. Wow. The specific alphabetical character, U, clearly indicated to the trained astronomer a peak signal intensity exactly 30 times louder, incredibly more energetic, than the standard deep space background noise surrounding it. But the sheer, staggering volume of the signal was definitely not the most terrifying, inexplicable part of the legendary wow signal. It was the exacting, incredibly specific frequency of the transmission. The powerful signal hit the massive big ear antenna precisely, and only at the very specific 1420 MHz frequency line on the dial. This is definitely not a random, uninteresting number plucked from the endless electromagnetic spectrum. In the highly specialized, mathematical field of radio astronomy, the 1420 MHz bandwidth is universally known as the hydrogen line. It is the exact natural emission frequency of neutral hydrogen atoms, which definitively and overwhelmingly constitutes the single most abundant element in the entire observable physical universe. 2 decades earlier, brilliant theoretical physicists Philip Morrison and Giuseppe Cocconi had successfully published a highly influential seminal paper in the prestigious journal Nature, successfully arguing that if a highly advanced, intelligent alien species actively wanted to reliably communicate across the vast, incredibly noisy interstellar distances, they would logically, intuitively choose the 1420 MHz hydrogen line. It was theorized to be the universal, mathematical calling card, the logical, perfectly quiet communication bandwidth of the cosmos. It was precisely, exactly where human scientists actively predicted an incredibly intelligent, vastly superior extraterrestrial species would definitively set their massive radio dials to loudly scream hello across the empty parsecs of space. Furthermore, the startling signal possessed all the distinct, undeniable mathematical hallmarks of a deliberate, artificially focused, pinpoint source. It was intensely narrowband, essentially meaning it was heavily focused into a very tight, highly specific communication channel, completely unlike massive, chaotic natural cosmic phenomena like exploding quasars, spinning pulsars, or colliding black holes, which universally and messily splatter their immense kinetic energy across a very wide, easily identifiable range of broad frequencies. And additionally, it lasted for precisely 72 seconds. This, too, was a massive, incredibly significant piece of the confusing puzzle. Because the physical Big Ear telescope was completely stationary, bolted firmly to the Ohio ground, and swept the sky continuously solely through the Earth's daily mechanical rotation, a fixed, distant extraterrestrial radio source entering the telescope's narrow observation window would logically, naturally build in signal intensity for exactly 36 seconds as the beam centered on it, reach an absolute, undeniable peak, and then mathematically decrease for a further 36 seconds as the Earth physically turned away from the target star system. The WOW signal perfectly, flawlessly followed this exact, textbook 72-second parabolic bell curve. The signal had originated directly from a very specific, triangulated point in the dense constellation Sagittarius, located near the incredibly thick, star-packed, chaotic center of the Milky Way galaxy. It was definitively the closest humanity had ever physically come to comprehensively answering Enrico Fermi's terrifying paradox. It was the smoking gun, the pristine fingerprint, the undeniable echo heard loud and clear in the paralyzing silence of the dark forest. The subsequent, feverish investigation launched SETI into an absolute frenzy of renewed government funding, global academic interest, and a terrifying, feverish optimism. Observational astronomers situated in highly advanced facilities across the entire globe simultaneously pointed their largest, most powerful, multi-million-dollar instruments directly toward Sagittarius, focusing specifically and intensely on the exact, precise celestial coordinates where the WOW signal definitively originated. Massive, complex, heavily funded projects like the impressive Allen Telescope Array, and much later, the heavily backed Breakthrough Listen initiative, scoured the exact, millimeter-precise patch of sky for decades. They found nothing, not a single solitary whisper, not even a faint, confusing blip. The signal absolutely never, ever repeated. The line went completely, utterly dead. The profound, heavy silence that immediately followed the WOW pulse was absolutely, scientifically maddening. It transformed overnight from the potential greatest, most paradigm-shifting discovery in the history of human civilization into its most agonizing, infuriating, unsolvable modern mystery. By the strict, unyielding rules of the scientific method, a physical phenomenon absolutely must be independently observable, recordable, and critically, repeatedly testable to be officially confirmed as fact. The WOW signal completely defied repeatability. Countless skeptics frequently argue aggressively that it was merely a temporary, terrestrial anomaly, a highly classified, strictly secretive military satellite broadcast accidentally bouncing awkwardly off unrecognized space debris, a secret black project aircraft transmission bleeding into the wrong frequency, or simply an incredibly freak, localized reflection of earthbound, mundane radio interference. Recently, detailed scientific theories have forcefully emerged suggesting the powerful signal was naturally caused by a unique pair of specifically passing comets releasing massive, dense clouds of neutral hydrogen gas, a hypothesis that, while scientifically plausible on paper, remains incredibly, hotly contested by many angry original SETI researchers who correctly point out the incredible, near impossible unlikelihood of an unthinking comet perfectly, deliberately mimicking a highly concentrated, non-varying narrowband artificial transmission. Years later, Jerry Amen, the patient, meticulous man who excitedly circled the numbers with his red pen in 1977, gave a widely watched interview deeply reflecting on the enduring, agonizing ambiguity of his momentous discovery. He shrugged his tired shoulders, leaning back heavily in his office chair, his face etched with decades of unanswered questions. I have spent countless decades constantly looking at that single, frail printout, analyzing those 6 characters over and over, Amen stated, his voice heavily tinged with the profound, exhausting frustration of an impossible, unanswered cosmic question. We absolutely should have seen it again. We rigorously searched and searched the sky for decades, but we never ever did. It was either a highly advanced, impossibly intelligent alien civilization deliberately, precisely beaming an incredibly powerful signal directly at our specific local cluster, or it was a completely unknown, incredibly rare, freak natural phenomenon that perfectly, mathematically mimicked a highly advanced intelligence. And honestly, objectively speaking, both of those possibilities are absolutely terrifying. If it was merely an incredible freak anomaly, it only reinforces our devastating isolation. It means the physical universe is a cruel, chaotic phantom house of deceptive optical tricks, producing incredibly powerful, misleading signals that look specifically like intelligence just to brutally mock our lonely, desperate search. But what if it was undeniably an alien civilization, sitting quietly in Sagittarius? Why did they only speak once? In the terrifying, paranoid context of the dark forest theory, the single, fleeing, incredibly tight pulse of the wow signal becomes infinitely more sinister, painting a horrifying picture. Imagine a terrified, isolated scout, tragically separated from his heavily armed platoon, wandering hopelessly through incredibly dense, deeply hostile enemy territory. He realizes with sickening dread that he is completely lost. In a sudden, foolish moment of sheer, unthinking desperation, he instinctively turns on an incredibly powerful, blinding magnesium flashlight and waves it frantically in the night air for just a single minute, hoping intensely to signal his distant friends. But then, as he carefully scans the surrounding dark trees, illuminating the shadows, he realizes his fatal, utterly suicidal mistake. He instantly turns off the flashlight. He drops completely, silently to the soft ground. He holds his shallow breath, desperately praying to any god that he wasn't definitively seen by the heavily armed hunters stalking the woods. A single, brief, incredibly powerful transmission instantly cut off is exactly, precisely, terrifyingly what you would logically expect from a desperate or foolish civilization that momentarily forgot the absolute first rule of cosmic survival, suddenly realized their incredibly catastrophic error, and instantly, violently imposed an absolute, impenetrable, permanently silenced radio blackout. If they are truly out there, the astrophysicist David Brin noted in his aggressive critique of METI, and they are significantly older, infinitely wiser, and technologically vastly more advanced than us. Why are they all so incredibly, suspiciously quiet? Was the 1977 WOW signal a benevolent, automated beacon patiently sweeping the massive galaxy like an enormous cosmic lighthouse, simply never mathematically rotating our way again within a human lifetime? Was it the immense, highly energetic exhaust plume of a colossal, relativistic interstellar spacecraft briefly firing its massive engines and inadvertently, accidentally passing swiftly through Earth's direct line of sight? Or was it something fundamentally worse, infinitely darker? Was it a terrified death cry, a rapidly collapsing civilization shouting one last, desperate time for help across the void before the silent, invisible hunters of the dark forest descended violently upon their atmosphere and permanently, efficiently silenced their entire burning world? We will almost certainly never know the truth. The agonizing ghost frequencies of the universe constantly tantalize us, continuously producing completely inexplicable fast radio bursts from unimaginably distant, ancient galaxies that utterly defy concrete explanation, or weird, highly rhythmic, structured pulses that undeniably resemble high-level mathematics before vanishing entirely back into the dull, hissing static. The cosmic radio dial is absolutely full of teasing ghosts, but absolutely none remain as mathematically clear or as profoundly, existentially haunting as the WOW signal. It serves constantly as a stark, unyielding reminder of our severe, humbling limitations. Even if the dense forest is completely full of unseen voices, even if an entire, massive, bustling galactic empire is continuously communicating all around us through means we cannot comprehend, we only ever clumsily catch fleeting, incomprehensible syllables before the stellar solar wind permanently drowns them out. But while dedicated Earth astrophysicists intensely, painfully strain their massive mechanical, dish-shaped ears eagerly listening for incredibly faint, fading radio waves echoing from the depths of deep space, they completely, catastrophically failed to recognize the horrifying possibility that the dark forest might not be comfortably limited solely to easily detectable radio waves. The hyper-advanced hunters do not rely merely on hearing. Sometime in the early 21st century, something physically massive, impossibly, unnaturally fast, and entirely, chillingly silent quietly, effortlessly entered our immediate, supposedly safe solar system. It wasn't a radio signal bouncing off an ionosphere. It was a tangible, physical object, and it violently forced the global scientific community to rapidly reconsider just how terrifyingly close the edge of the forest actually, physically is to our fragile front door. On the completely unremarkable, clear, crisp Thursday evening of October 19, 2017, Canadian astronomer Robert Warwick, a meticulous, highly focused postdoctoral researcher stationed firmly at the prestigious Institute for Astronomy physically located at the University of Hawaii, was quietly, systematically reviewing fresh observational data. The data was being continuously collected by the incredibly powerful sky-scanning pan-SDARRS, one telescope comfortably perched atop the high, dormant volcanic peak of Haleakala. His primary designated job was to continuously, vigilantly monitor near-Earth objects, mostly familiar, trackable lumps of ancient rock and dirty ice that orbit our sun predictably, occasionally wandering terrifyingly, dangerously close to Earth's fragile atmosphere. But on this particular, world-altering Thursday, The computerized data stream definitively did not show a familiar, mathematically predictable asteroid or a standard, dusty comet. Warwick noticed a brilliant streak of light moving incredibly aggressively at a velocity that completely, violently defied everything he and the scientific establishment knew definitively about the gravitational mechanics of our local solar system. The mysterious object, initially heavily debated and temporarily designated a 2017 U1 by bewildered astronomers, was traveling at an absolutely astonishing, mind-bending speed of approximately 196,000 miles per hour. That extreme, hyperbolic speed was a critical, undeniable, mathematical piece of irrefutable evidence. It was moving far, far too fast to ever be caught in the massive gravitational pull of the sun. It was an interstellar interloper, a complete alien to our solar system. Warwick had undeniably, accidentally discovered the very first physical object in perfectly recorded human history to physically enter our solar system from the deep, uncharted, terrifyingly vast wilderness of interstellar space. He beautifully, poetically named the object Oumuamua, a culturally significant Hawaiian word that roughly translates to the scout, or the messenger from afar arriving first. The name was undeniably romantic and poetic, but considering the terrifying, heavily paranoid implications deeply embedded within the dark forest theory, it was also profoundly chilling. A highly advanced, incredibly fast scout from the dark forest had just drifted casually, silently past our cosmic front porch, taking a completely uninvited look into our lighted windows. As high-powered telescopes situated rapidly around the entire globe scrambled frantically, desperately to observe the fleeting, incredibly fast object before it vanished completely back into the freezing, absolute void of deep space, the raw data returned from the Oumuamua observations grew increasingly, almost maddeningly bizarre. The object did not physically look, behave, or act like any known, documented asteroid or icy comet ever cataloged by the vast history of human astronomy. First and foremost, its physical, structural shape was entirely unprecedented and completely defied the natural, expected mechanics of celestial body formation. Based meticulously on careful measurements of the distinct variations in its brightness, as it theoretically tumbled end over end through the vacuum of space, astronomers logically deduced it was highly, severely elongated. Some complex mathematical models strongly suggested it was shaped exactly like a massive, rocky cigar. Several other, equally valid light curve models proposed it was extremely flattened, shaped uniquely like an immense, dark pancake, tumbling erratically through the solar system. But its incredibly weird shape was definitely not the most disturbing, inexplicable anomaly reported by the bewildered observers. Most traditional icy comets, when they rapidly approach the intense, melting heat of the sun, naturally and dependably undergo a violent process known universally as outgassing. The frozen ice locked on their surface rapidly, visibly turns into expansive vapor, predictably creating a massive, glowing coma and a beautiful, highly prominent trailing tail of fine dust and illuminated gas. The object Oumuamua, however, showed absolutely, completely no physical signs of any outgassing whatsoever. It definitively did not have a visible tail. It did not emit any detectable cloud of gas or space dust. It was a completely cold, perfectly silent, entirely dark object flying through the inner solar system. Yet, despite this absolute lack of standard propulsion-generating outgassing, the object did something fundamentally, physically impossible according to standard Newtonian mechanics. It accelerated. As Oumuamua rapidly passed the sun and confidently began its steep, hyperbolic trajectory out of our solar system. Its speed observably increased, deviating significantly and measurably from a predictable, standard path dictated purely by gravity alone. This sustained, non-gravitational acceleration threw the entire global astronomical community into a bewildered, fiercely debating frenzy of competing theories. It was a completely silent, totally unexplainable physical push that could not be accounted for by thermal venting. Avi Loeb, the highly esteemed, brilliant chair of Harvard University's astronomy department, aggressively stepped forward into the spotlight with a controversial hypothesis that violently shattered the rigorous, heavily conservative culture of academic astrophysics. He looked intently at the verified data, the bizarre, highly elongated shape, the complete, undeniable lack of outgassing, the anomalous, physics-defying acceleration, and he deliberately, loudly said the quiet part out loud to a shocked public. When you honestly consider all these compounding anomalies, Loeb argued passionately in a highly controversial scientific paper and subsequent best-selling book, the absolute simplest, most elegant explanation, the singular theory that fits all the observed facts perfectly without requiring us to simultaneously invent entirely new, unproven physics or incredibly, statistically impossible natural atmospheric phenomena, is a completely artificial origin. Loeb proposed boldly that the object might be an ancient, manufactured artifact, perhaps a piece of highly advanced space debris, a vast, incredibly thin light sail powered purely by the gentle push of stellar radiation, torn violently from a massive interstellar craft eons ago, currently tumbling aimlessly, blindly through the galaxy. Or significantly, terrifically worse, a highly functional, entirely stealthy surveillance probe, specifically a self-replicating von Neumann machine, deliberately sent by an impossibly ancient, expansionist galactic civilization to secretly map, meticulously survey, and carefully monitor the technological development of passing star systems like ours. If you are walking casually on a beach, Loeb frequently, forcefully addressed his fiercely critical, extremely skeptical peers in furious debates, and you have lived your entire life surrounded exclusively by beautifully polished, naturally occurring rocks, you might be extremely tempted to stubbornly assume that every single object on the beach is naturally a rock. But if you see a shiny, strangely shaped, mathematically perfect object that reflects the rising sun in a completely unnatural, structured way, you absolutely don't assume it's just a uniquely shaped, highly improbable piece of granite carved perfectly by the waves. You must seriously consider the terrifying, paradigm-shifting possibility that it might be manufactured plastic. As objective scientists, we must absolutely be entirely open to the distinct possibility of the artificial. Oumuamua was an incredibly fast, frustratingly fleeting visitor, but a mere 2 years prior to its arrival, another utterly baffling astronomical anomaly forced the deeply skeptical scientific community to rapidly confront the horrifying, awe-inspiring idea that the absolute silence of the dark forest might not equate comfortably to total emptiness, but merely to incredible, unimaginable stealth successfully operating on a scale that defies human comprehension. In the year 2015, Tabitha Boyajian, an absolutely brilliant astronomer diligently analyzing massive sets of photometric data collected precisely by the Kepler Space Telescope, noticed something profoundly, fundamentally wrong with a mature star, designated officially as KIC 8,462,852, located roughly 1,470 light-years from Earth in the constellation Cygnus. The primary mission of the Kepler telescope is to tirelessly search for Earth-like exoplanets by meticulously observing the transit method, detecting the incredibly minuscule, perfectly periodic, totally predictable dip in a distant star's brightness when a planet's physical bulk passes directly in front of it. A massive planet exactly the size of Jupiter, the undisputed largest gas giant in our solar system, predictably causes a typical star's brightness to dip by a mere, barely detectable 1%. Tabby's star, as the mysterious celestial body quickly became known globally, was dimming completely chaotically. It wasn't dipping by a standard, predictable 1%. It was dipping dramatically, catastrophically, by up to an astonishing 22% of its total light output. Furthermore, the massive dips were entirely, utterly irregular, completely unpredictable, and massive in duration. No known planet, and definitely no massive swarm of icy comets, the leading, desperate natural explanation offered by a confused scientific community, could realistically, permanently block out nearly a quarter of the total light emitted from a massive, mature, main sequence F-type star. The sheer, overwhelming amount of physical cosmic dust required to reliably create such a massive, prolonged occlusion would be astronomically, almost physically impossible to gather and maintain in orbit. Astronomer Jason Wright, deeply intrigued and fascinated by Bayesian's impeccable, flawless data, offered a highly controversial hypothesis that immediately, strongly evoked the staggering, godlike scale of a Type II civilization clearly defined on the Kardashev scale, an unimaginably advanced society fully capable of successfully harnessing the total, complete energy output of its host star. He suggested publicly the Kepler telescope was currently directly observing the construction of an alien megastructure. Specifically, Wright boldly hypothesized that the erratic, massive dimming could be the undeniable thermal signature of an incomplete Dyson swarm currently under heavy construction. A legendary Dyson swarm is a grand, purely theoretical engineering concept originally, beautifully proposed by physicist Freeman Dyson. A colossal, mathematically incredibly complex cloud of billions of solar power collecting satellites and vast orbital habitats completely, perfectly surrounding a star to capture every single photon of its energy output. If an incredibly advanced, infinitely powerful civilization was actively building such a mind-boggling structure, deliberately, mechanically dragging the massive physical mass of entire rocky planets into the star's inner orbit to systematically construct massive, continent-sized, hyper-efficient solar panels, it would effectively, irregularly block the light exactly, precisely, as Tabby's star was demonstrating to the bewildered astronomers. Forget the silly, outdated little green men flying around in silver, saucer-shaped ships. Prominent proponents of the terrifying megastructure hypothesis argued vigorously. What if the incredibly rare aliens we finally encounter are so vastly, so overwhelmingly superior in capability that their basic engineering projects literally, physically span entire solar systems? How exactly does a primitive, single-celled bacterium successfully fight back against the brilliant architect designing the building? Of course, the deeply conservative scientific establishment rallied fiercely, quickly formulating alternative, highly complex natural explanations. Uneven, collapsing interstellar dust clouds, recently violently smashed exoplanets creating massive debris fields, or an extremely rare, incredibly complex swarm of gigantic exocomets are currently the favored, accepted theories for Tabby's star, exactly just as a bizarre, incredibly porous, nitrogen iceberg, is currently the leading, desperate natural explanation attempting to debunk Avi Loeb's artificial theory regarding Oumuamua. But the underlying, deeply unsettling, and heavily scrutinized truth remains impossible to ignore. As our terrestrial telescopes incredibly become more technologically powerful, deeper seeing, and immensely more sensitive, the universe's catalog of baffling anomalies is rapidly, undeniably stacking up. We are increasingly finding massive things that look incredibly, suspiciously like the terrifying debris of the dark forest, advanced, highly stealthy scout ships quietly passing in the long, dark night, or the colossal, incomprehensible, star-spanning ruins proudly built entirely around distant, flickering suns. While they are still overwhelmingly, statistically likely to be unexplainable, complex natural phenomena, the deeply haunting, paranoia-inducing possibility definitely persists. If the incredibly advanced, invisible hunters heavily employ physics-defying probes exactly like Oumuamua, the deadly theoretical game of interstellar survival isn't simply an academic theory debated safely on Earth. The brutal survival game has already officially started, and to our absolute horror, we might already inadvertently be completely active on the deadly cosmic board. Imagine, if you will, that you are nervously seated completely alone at a small, perfectly square, immaculately clean steel table, situated securely in an entirely empty, profoundly windowless concrete room. The air circulating through the discrete vents is rigidly stagnant and uncomfortably cold. Directly in front of you, gleaming under the harsh, humming fluorescent light, rests a simple, brilliantly red button, wired heavily and unmistakably to an incredibly massive explosive device bolted securely beneath your chair. Beside the red button is a crisp, newly printed note, written in clear, unambiguous, mathematically precise language. If you do not physically press this red button within the next 5 agonizing minutes, a complete stranger seated securely in an identical concrete room situated hundreds of miles away might suddenly decide to press theirs. If the unseen stranger presses theirs exactly before you manage to press yours, you will absolutely and instantly die. If, however, you press your button first, you will absolutely survive, and the distant stranger will perish instantly in a blinding flash. This physically terrifying, psychologically devastating scenario is definitely not a dark, sadistic moral ethics test designed specifically by a cynical philosopher or a deranged psychologist to study human cruelty. It is a fundamental, deeply mathematically inescapable dilemma, firmly rooted entirely in the dry, academic field of advanced game theory. It is the cold, unyielding mathematics of absolute biological survival, stripped cleanly and completely of all comforting human sentimentality, moral posturing, and ethical debate. It is the absolute core, horrifying logic that strictly dictates the permanently paralyzing, silent standoff of all interstellar diplomacy. The brutal, unforgiving dilemma presented precisely by the red button perfectly illustrates exactly why the vast physical distance, the immense cosmological time, and the wildly differing alien biology make total, preemptive physical destruction the absolute only logical, mathematically rational choice, whenever two completely unknown, technologically advanced entities unexpectedly encounter one another in the deepest, darkest depths of the cosmic forest of the universe. We optimistically and frequently imagine that a triumphant, historic first contact with an advanced alien intelligence would closely resemble the heavily dramatic, deeply beautiful scenes of popular, hopeful science fiction movies. In cinematic masterpieces like Arrival or Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Incredibly wise, impossibly ancient, and profoundly benevolent beings manage to communicate their peaceful intentions via highly elaborate mathematical puzzles or deeply resonant, harmonious musical tones played across a synthesizer keyboard. In these deeply comforting, entirely human-centric narratives, a temporarily tense military standoff between terrified humans and mysterious aliens usually gives way almost immediately to a profound, deeply emotional mutual understanding, firmly establishing a rock-solid foundation of interstellar trust and eventual galaxy-spanning cooperation. But unfortunately, the brutal reality of interstellar space is decidedly not a scripted Hollywood movie. The fundamental, unyielding physical reality of the vast, impossible distance currently situated between the stars renders any form of real-time, meaningful communication completely and physically impossible, restricted permanently by the absolute speed limit of the universe, the speed of light. If a newly discovered alien civilization is situated a mere 100 light-years away from our planet Earth, which is essentially our immediate, localized galactic neighbor when observing the massive scale of the Milky Way, a single, simple, casual radio conversation requires exactly 2 entire centuries to mathematically complete a single exchange of information. "Hello, we are humans," you excitedly, proudly broadcast into the sky, sitting down and waiting for the equivalent of an entire, long human lifespan just for your radio signal to physically reach their distant, listening receivers. 100 long, bloody, politically chaotic human years slowly pass on Earth. "Hello, we hear you," the aliens finally reply, and incredibly, another entire century slowly, agonizingly grinds away before their distant, ancient response physically reaches our waiting descendants, who might no longer even speak the same language or possess the same political structures as the people who originally sent the greeting. You absolutely cannot predictably or successfully aggressively negotiate a highly delicate, complex peace treaty or an intricate trade agreement when multiple, distinct, successive generations of citizens are born, live full, complicated lives, fight terrestrial world wars, create brilliant new art, and die completely between every single transmitted sentence. The sheer, overwhelming, mathematically unbridgeable gap in communication time breeds a completely unbreakable, rapidly compounding, incredibly paranoid chain of suspicion. You fundamentally do not know, and cannot possibly know, exactly what the other distant civilization is currently physically doing, while your friendly historical message is in transit across the void. They could be entirely peaceful, dedicating their resources to philosophy and art. Or they could be rapidly shifting their entire planetary economy and vast resources from peaceful, benign astronomical exploration directly to the aggressive, heavily guarded construction of colossal, relativistic mass drivers aimed squarely and mercilessly at our vulnerable yellow sun. You do not know precisely what they are planning, and crucially, they do not know with any absolute certainty if you currently know that they are intensely suspecting you of exactly the same hostile actions. Without instant, verifiable, real-time communication, a hardened, deeply cynical military strategist or game theorist might aggressively argue, carefully analyzing the cold, unfeeling mathematics of the classic prisoner's dilemma applied heavily on a truly galactic, species-ending scale. The firm establishment of long-term trust is literally, completely, mathematically impossible. You cannot possibly verify their stated intentions. You cannot effectively monitor their strict adherence to a diplomatic treaty or a disarmament pact. Trust absolutely requires physical verification, Without immediate verification, you are relying entirely on completely blind, extremely foolish faith. And in the dark forest, blind faith is absolutely suicidal. This fundamentally terrifying inability to effectively communicate is exacerbated exponentially, terrifyingly, by the well-documented, historically proven concept of the sudden technological leap. As firmly established in the bleak axioms of cosmic sociology, human technological and scientific progress is definitely not linear. It is wildly exponential. For hundreds of thousands of slow, agonizingly unchanging years, our primitive human ancestors existed in the harsh Paleolithic era, slowly, painstakingly fashioning roughly the exact same rudimentary, chipped stone tools generation after generation. But in the incredibly brief, cosmologically insignificant span of a mere few thousand years following the agricultural revolution, we rapidly built monumental stone civilizations, mathematically split the microscopic atom, explored the cratered surface of our desolate moon, and brilliantly harnessed the invisible power of the electromagnetic spectrum. This rapid, practically instantaneous technological acceleration fundamentally completely alters the delicate balance of galactic deterrence. Suppose an incredibly advanced, immensely powerful, starfaring hunter prowling through the dark forest. Let's confidently assume a massive, practically godlike Type-I civilization fully capable of completely harnessing massive amounts of stellar energy, spots a seemingly primitive, completely unthreatening biological civilization huddled on a tiny blue rock. Let's vividly say they carefully, silently observe our planet Earth entirely during the height of the Roman Empire, detecting our very primitive, smoking campfires, the dull glint of our iron swords, or the geometric layout of our burgeoning agriculture. The highly advanced observing civilization might actually feel a brief, fleeting surge of profound scientific curiosity, or even deep, emotional biological pity when observing us. They might deliberately decide to leave the primitive, struggling species completely alone, extremely confident in their own overwhelming, unchallengeable technological and military superiority. But because of the incredibly vast, unbridgeable distances of deep space, any astronomical observation is perfectly an outdated window into the distant past. By the exact time the ancient observation data eventually returns to the advanced civilization thousands of years later, humanity's crude technology could have explosively, incredibly erupted heavily into a technological singularity. The primitive, bumbling, sword-wielding civilization they generously, perhaps foolishly spared entirely out of sheer pity today could, within a single, brief cosmological millisecond, confidently possess terrifying weapons absolutely capable of instantly annihilating their entire, massive star system tomorrow. The hunter deeply embedded in the forest cannot logically afford even a single ounce of mercy, because specifically in the dark forest, unpredictable, massive technological leaps happen completely exponentially, violently transforming yesterday's primitive, deeply vulnerable infants into tomorrow's absolutely ruthless, unstoppable executioners. The absolute only safe, securely known biology is a permanently, violently neutralized biology. Does this cold, calculating logic sound incredibly cruel, vicious, and unbelievably cynical to you? Does it seem deeply paranoid, inherently dystopian, and entirely devoid of the universally noble, uplifting human spirit of grand exploration? We judge this incredibly harsh, mathematically sound logic comfortably from the ultimate safety and extreme comfort of an entirely unthreatened, biologically homogeneous, currently isolated Earth. We possess the unique, incredible luxury of intensely debating the high morality of preemptive, destructive strikes simply because we currently face absolutely no known, heavily armed extraterrestrial enemy pointing a gun at our heads. But basic biological survival, especially scaled massively on a cosmic galactic scale, definitively does not care about your petty human morality. The vast, expanding universe is completely, beautifully, and horrifyingly indifferent to your deeply held, deeply personal ethical principles. Survival only cares about cold, hard mathematics, speed, and brutal probabilities. The visionary Chinese science fiction author Liu Cixin vividly, terrifyingly illustrated this horrifying, inescapable dynamic in his deeply cynical Dark Forest narrative directly through the introduction of the chilling concept of the photoid strike. A photoid is definitely not a highly complex, incredibly expensive, massively engineered armada of sleek, beautifully polished, laser-firing interstellar destroyers dramatically jumping out of hyperspace. It is, terrifyingly, a highly casual, incredibly cheap, profoundly effective weapon of absolute mass destruction. It is essentially a relatively small, physically insignificant piece of dense matter, perhaps not much larger or heavier than a standard tennis ball or a smooth river pebble, mechanically accelerated perfectly to nearly the absolute speed of light, and fired directly, unceremoniously, and silently into the core of a target star from light years away. When a photoid cleanly strikes a stable, burning sun, the immense kinetic energy instantly, violently triggers an artificial, totally massive supernova sequence, instantaneously expanding the star into a blazing inferno and completely, totally consuming all the orbital planets heavily within that fragile solar system in a wall of inescapable, blinding plasma. It is a perfectly, utterly silent, totally unblockable, physics-defying shot fired cheaply from the incredibly deep black. The hunter definitively doesn't even need to risk sending precious, valuable ground troops or engaging deeply in a horrifically protracted, incredibly expensive, highly risky interstellar war. They simply, casually launch a cheap, fast relativistic mass driver directly at the broadcasting source coordinates of a noisy, developing civilization, and then they comfortably wait for the blinding light of the violently exploding star to definitely confirm the easy kill centuries later. It is the absolute, ultimate, terrifying democratization of complete destruction. This is the grim, unshakable synthesis of the Dark Forest theory. The agonizing, heavily discussed silence of the universe is decidedly not an atmospheric, spooky setting designed to entertain us. It is an absolute, non-negotiable tactical necessity for biological continuation. The entire cosmos is deeply paralyzed by a universal, entirely unbreakable Mexican standoff. Every single surviving, intelligent civilization is actively, desperately hiding in the pitch black, nervously holding a heavily loaded, extremely powerful gun in the dark, their sweaty finger hovering dangerously close over the hair trigger, utterly terrified of making even the slightest, smallest sound, and waiting anxiously in the eternal darkness for someone, anyone else, to accidentally step on a dry twig. And where exactly does that terrifying, cosmic reality firmly leave humanity? We are the unbelievably loud, deeply unaware, incredibly noisy children of Earth, who have essentially already happily, foolishly fired our massively bright, extremely loud flare gun directly into the black sky with the incredibly powerful Arecibo message and the Voyager golden records. The terrifying chain of suspicion has, almost certainly, already begun to coldly, meticulously calculate our exact, undeniable spatial coordinates based on our own, foolishly provided data. What is our duty now in the face of absolute cosmic paranoia? Stand barefoot on the jagged, wet edge of the Pacific Ocean on a completely moonless, utterly silent, profoundly dark night. Far, incredibly geographically distant from the harsh, artificial, blindingly bright orange glare of massive, sprawling coastal cities. Let the sharply cold, intensely stinging salt air fill your fragile biological lungs completely. Listen deeply to the rhythmic, ancient, deeply indifferent crashing of the relentless tide, violently smashing against the unyielding, jagged coastal rocks, precisely exactly as it has done mechanically for billions of years before the first primitive human ever drew a breath, and exactly as it will continue mechanically to do for billions of years long after the final human footprint slowly, inevitably washes away. Now look up slowly at the seemingly endless, suffocatingly black spread of the immense night sky, pierced only faintly by the ancient, incredibly freezing light of distant, terrifying stars. Contemplate, critically, just for a single, fleeting, terrifying moment, the sheer, crushing, physically incomprehensible scale and depth of what you are actually, physically seeing. You are a microscopic, incredibly complex carbon-based biological speck, currently standing tenuously on the thin, geologically fragile cracked crust of a relatively small, highly unstable, watery rock. That tiny blue rock is hurtling incredibly fast through an endless, freezing, completely frictionless void at roughly 67,000, incredibly fast miles per hour, caught permanently in the massive, inescapable gravitational embrace of a totally unremarkable, average yellow dwarf star. And that comparatively tiny star is drifting slowly, inevitably through the sprawling, dusty suburbs of a massive, spiraling galaxy containing roughly 400 billion other, equally bright suns, all floating aimlessly in an expanding universe so incomprehensibly, staggeringly vast and incredibly old that physical light itself theoretically takes billions of agonizingly long years just to cross it. You absolutely, logically, scientifically should be completely terrified. The entire, observable physical universe is a colossal, indifferent, deeply violent machine that operates effortlessly on scales of extreme time, immense pressure, and incredible violence that make the entire sprawling breadth of recorded human history look exactly like a remarkably fleeting, largely insignificant, momentary spark struck randomly off a flint in a massive hurricane. And yet, incredibly, in spite of the crushing, mathematically impossible probabilities stacked heavily against us, despite the chaotic, unpredictable violence of constant asteroidal bombardment, deadly stellar radiation, sweeping ice ages, and repeated planetary mass extinction events, you are currently, undeniably still breathing the cold air. We, as an incredibly resilient, brilliant species, are still miraculously here, looking stubbornly up at the terrifying dark. If the incredibly vast universe is indeed as deeply, fundamentally hostile as the mathematics suggest, if the absolute, deafening silence we desperately, optimistically mistake for cosmic peace is actually the terrifying, deeply paranoid quiet of a massive dark forest filled completely with unseen, heavily armed, perfectly camouflaged hunters, then the actual, fundamental value of incredibly rare human civilization increases exponentially, almost beyond any capacity for human comprehension. The terrifying mathematical realization of our profound, existential interstellar isolation absolutely should not plunge us foolishly into a deep, nihilistic, paralyzing despair. Rather, it should entirely, fundamentally, and aggressively recalibrate exactly how we deeply understand our precarious, incredibly privileged place in the vast, unfeeling cosmos. Our highly fragile, fiercely beautiful existence on this tiny pale blue dot is definitely not a cheap, entirely accidental, easily replaceable commodity to be squandered. It is an astonishing, mathematically impossible biological miracle. It is the hard-won, incredibly precise result of roughly 4 billion long, punishing years of an unbroken, incredibly lucky, fiercely competitive evolutionary history that successfully outranked every other organism on the planet. Let us definitely not loudly, aggressively invite the hunters perfectly disguised in the dark. A highly pragmatic, modern, deeply concerned planetary defense strategist might aggressively argue, carefully analyzing the terrifying, absolutely logical, and deeply unsettling implications of the dark forest theory, while sitting securely in a highly classified, heavily reinforced concrete subterranean bunker. Let us instead carefully, quietly tend to our own small, precious, incredibly fragile fire. We are undeniably a deeply flawed species currently barely, awkwardly stepping out of our own highly chaotic technological infancy. We have absolutely not yet successfully secured our own continued planetary survival on Earth, let alone firmly, safely established a multi-planetary foothold on Mars or the Moon to guarantee our species' continuity against a localized disaster. We are incredibly reckless, naive infants wildly playing with burning matches in a massive, fully stocked ammunition armory. The highly responsible, entirely logical and biologically imperative action is entirely clear. We must absolutely shut down all active METI beacons. We must instantly stop arrogantly, blindly shouting our exact, highly precise spatial coordinates into the incredibly dangerous dark. We must patiently, quietly mature as a unified global species, safely hidden beneath the canopy, until we are fully, technologically capable of confidently defending the precious, singular fire we have built against any and all massive, cosmic threats. The sudden, deeply necessary global shift in serious astrobiological strategy from loudly, indiscriminately shouting into the void, the highly controversial practice of METI to heavily prioritizing profound planetary stealth, massive planetary defense mechanisms, and incredibly careful, silent astronomical observation, is the absolute only logical, scientifically defensible response to the terrifying, inescapable reality of the unyielding Fermi Paradox. Our beautiful, deeply complex music, our agonizingly complex, bloody, triumphant history, our profound evolutionary capabilities for intense love and highly abstract mathematical thought, our brilliant, awe-inspiring art and magnificent architecture, these deeply human creations are profoundly, staggeringly rare. If the brutal, uncompromising logic of the dark forest theory is indeed correct, they might incredibly be entirely unique within our entire observable galactic sector. Perhaps the ultimate, profound, incredibly beautiful answer required to firmly resolve the terrifying Fermi Paradox is decidedly not to violently conquer the stars in a massive, blazing wave of glorious, imperial expansion, but simply, stubbornly to outlive them. Perhaps the greatest, most profound, infinitely resilient rebellion a physically small, incredibly fragile species can possibly mount against a cold, entirely murderous, unforgiving universe is to simply, quietly, and persistently continue existing. We absolutely must strive with every fiber of our being to be the one warm, continuous, unbroken light burning brightly in the freezing, absolute dark, completely refusing to be casually snuffed out by either the frequent, unthinking, casual violence of the physical cosmos, or the calculated, highly predatory, entirely silent strikes of unseen, technologically superior neighbors stalking the woods. We inevitably return to the original, profound paradox brilliantly, mathematically formulated by the physicist Enrico Fermi on that incredibly bright, history-making summer afternoon in Los Alamos over 70 long years ago. Where is absolutely everybody? Yes, they are almost certainly out there, lurking deep in the black. The absolute, unbending mathematics and sheer, staggering scale of the universe practically, overwhelmingly guarantee it. Yes, they are incredibly terrifying in their potential capability to easily harness the absolute destructive, reality-altering power of advanced physics. But significantly, their very silence is also our temporary, incredibly valuable, life-saving shield. The agonizing, tense quiet of the dark forest buys us incredibly precious, vital time. It provides us exactly with the crucial, unbothered cosmological runway specifically necessary to comfortably pass our own incredibly dangerous great filter. It actively gives us the unique, unprecedented opportunity to successfully, carefully manage our own deeply dangerous, highly explosive technological adolescence, to permanently solve the massive, looming existential terrestrial threats of rogue artificial superintelligence, continued global nuclear proliferation, and the slow, suffocating death of catastrophic man-made climate change, long before we foolishly, prematurely step out of the safe, secure planetary crib and boldly into the incredibly dangerous, fiercely crowded, heavily armed, entirely ruthless adult world of interstellar galactic politics and terrifying survival. We are biologically and psychologically not so fundamentally, drastically different from the ancient, deeply traumatized Aztec priests bleeding desperately atop their magnificent, towering step pyramids in a highly coordinated, frantic effort to hold back the terrifying, mythological Tzitzimitl demons of the endlessly spinning sky. We are not so far removed culturally or emotionally from the deeply terrified, highly religious peasants explicitly documented in 1561 Nuremberg, dropping immediately to their trembling knees on the hard stone cobblestones as they watched massive, impossible geometric shapes violently battle completely through the crisp morning sun. Humanity has always intuitively known, deeply, inherently embedded perfectly in our collective, evolutionary psychological DNA, the profound, unshakable terror of the massive, uncaring cosmos. We have always recognized, instinctively and biologically, that the sky is incredibly, profoundly dangerous place filled with things that can absolutely kill us from above. But crucially, we are also the brilliant, astonishingly capable, intellectually powerful architects of the massive Arecibo Observatory and the profound Voyager probes. We are specifically the singular species brave enough, incredibly optimistic enough, and perhaps ultimately foolish enough to physically build a giant, incredibly sensitive mechanical ear, point it confidently at a dense cluster of 300,000 ancient stars, and boldly ask the terrifying universe if absolutely anyone else is lonely. Our primary, species-saving duty now, heavily armed with the terrifying mathematical possibility of the dark forest, is not to be the single loudest, most attention-seeking voice echoing blindly into the endless void. Our cosmic duty is not to blindly, arrogantly, and foolishly thrust our exact, localized coordinates directly into the probing, calculating faces of significantly older, infinitely wiser, and potentially far more utterly ruthless predators. Our fundamental, overriding duty is now entirely, intensely focused profoundly inward upon ourselves. Our ultimate duty is to carefully, patiently manage our own fragile, beautiful spark of consciousness, To nurture our developing, imperfect global civilization safely and securely through the incredibly precarious, deeply dangerous technological bottleneck of the coming critical centuries, and to successfully, quietly survive the immense, terrifying night. We absolutely must learn to deeply value the extraordinary, mathematically impossible rarity of the completely unique human experiment currently playing out on Earth, explicitly treating our blue planet not merely as an infinite, disposable resource to be lazily, blindly exploited until it is a dead husk, but as a heavily armored, incredibly valuable, fragile lifeboat drifting cautiously, silently through a violently hostile, unimaginably dangerous alien ocean. The universe is completely, beautifully, and terrifyingly silent tonight. The ancient stars burn consistently, with the exact same indifferent, incredibly cold mathematical precision they have rigorously maintained flawlessly for billions of unrecorded years. Close your heavy doors tightly against the encroaching dark. Put out your active, blazing METI beacons simultaneously. Carefully, silently shield your heat and radiation signatures behind thick atmospheric walls. And physically listen closely, deeply, and intensely carefully to the immense, sprawling, terrifying silence of the cosmic forest surrounding us. For one day, perhaps many thousands or even millions of long years from now, when we are finally truly ready, technologically capable, and heavily armed enough to confidently meet the unseen hunters firmly on equal footing, the great silence will abruptly break.